To this point in the semester, you have completed all of the different Greek indicative verb forms. In the last video, we talked about different suffixes and we reviewed those suffixes. You've been working on re-memorizing them. And what we're going to do in this video is sort of do a flyover approach to the different Greek indicative forms and give you a method for identifying the parsing information of different Greek indicative verb forms. That is a step-by-step way, a sort of order of operations to figure out what is going on with a given Greek indicative verb form. And at the end of this video, we're going to get some practice doing that together. So if you do not have close by specifically your Black Grammar, the textbook, or a lexicon, either one works. The Black Grammar probably is a little bit better for what we're going to do, but both of them would be useful for what we're going to do sort of as our lecture pauses at the end here. So once more, overview of Greek verbs here. We have seen all of these things at play. We've looked at the different ways that Greek tenses form, the way that Greek inflects for voice, for person, and for number. And with respect to Greek verbs for the rest of the semester, we'll be looking at the different Greek moods. So far in this course, we've only been in the indicative mood. As we move forward, we're going to introduce the imperative, the subjunctive, the infinitive, and also participles. We've also seen this chart a number of times here, how the different Greek verbs are formed. And what we're going to do with our method is sort of break down how to make this a little bit less overwhelming by telling you sort of a few steps to follow to figure out the parsing information of any given verb. But before we move to that, what I want to do is give a quick overview of what David Allen Black calls the different indicative verb morphemes. These are the different parts that make up a Greek verb. He compares them to a train, the locomotive being the sort of lexical morpheme, the stem or root of the word that makes it go, that gives it its basic meaning. And to that locomotive, to that most powerful train car, are added other things, other morphemes that change the meaning of the train or change the meaning of the verb. And so we're going to just talk and sort of put into more simple terms or put into bullet point format the different morphemes that David Allen Black gives you in the grammar. So we have the lexical morpheme, which is that locomotive that makes the word or the verb go. Then we have the past tense morpheme. This is in the form of an augment. That augment comes in different forms. Remember, the augment can be, usually is simply an epsilon at the beginning of a verb, or it can be, if the verb begins with a vowel, a lengthening of the vowel or the diphthong, or in the case of some vowels, it cannot lengthen. It's already in its lengthened form, so you won't see much of a change as to your augment. But the augment is going to be the past tense morpheme, so that when there is an augment, in whatever form it comes, it's going to indicate a past time, a past tense verb, namely an imperfect verb or an aorist verb. And so the past tense morpheme is going to go at the beginning of a verb, so it's going to come before the stem itself. The same is true of the perfective reduplication morphemes. And these are going to indicate the perfect tense or the pluperfect tense. And remember, just like the augment, reduplication can come in a couple of different forms. The most common form is the consonant repeating itself with an epsilon stuck after it, but we'll also see reduplication in a way that looks just like an augment. Sometimes reduplication will be just an epsilon stuck before the stem of the word, and also sometimes you'll see a sort of zero form reduplication where the reduplication is not entirely obvious, that there hasn't been a real change to the beginning of the verb. We also have the passive voice morphemes, and these are going to come after the lexical morpheme, after the locomotive that makes the verb go. And this is going to be in the form of theta, eta for first passive verbs, and then eta for just eta without the theta before it for second passive verbs. The future tense morpheme should be well known at this point. Sigma, indicating past time, and there's going to sometimes be the case where the sigma is not explicitly there. It's hiding in the verb form by means of amalgamation. That is, the sigma has been added on to the lexical morpheme, and the end of the lexical morpheme changes, the last letter changes on the basis of that sigma being added. And the same is true of the aorist morpheme, that the sigma of the sigma alpha for the first aorist tense morpheme is sort of hiding within the lexical morpheme itself. If the lexical morpheme ends with certain letters, that sigma is going to combine with those letters to form a different letter by means of amalgamation. A perfect morpheme is the kappa alpha that is characteristic of the first perfect tense, so indicating the perfect tense. And then the final morphemes are going to be those suffixes that you memorized in the last video that we worked on, both writing and speaking. And suffixes are going to indicate person and number, but they're also going to tell us more about tense and voice in particular. And we'll return to those in just a little bit here. And lastly, prepositional prefix morphemes. And these are going to come at the very beginning of a word. That, remember, a preposition, technically speaking, is something that has been preposed of a verb. So a proper preposition is one that has been actually attached to a verb, whereas an improper preposition is the preposition we normally think of, a preposition that stands on its own. But as to the name preposition, it implies it has been prepositioned to a verb. It's been stuck on in the first part of the verb. So prepositional prefixes are going to go at the very beginning, and even you'll see, if you remember, that things like the perfective reduplication or the past tense morpheme in the form of an augment are going to come after a prepositional prefix. So that if you have a preposition, the augment is going to come after the preposition in a verb rather than before the prepositional prefix. So, how do you go about identifying parsing information? Taking sort of that huge chart we have of the different ways that all these different indicative verbs form and condense it down. What should you do when you come across a Greek verb in the wild, as it were? And I'm going to give you 3 different steps here. I present them basically first, and then we'll go into them with a little more depth in just a moment here. The first is to check for augment or reduplication. And that's going to tell you if a verb is either past tense or perfect or pluperfect. So if you have an augment on a verb, you know it's going to be either the imperfect tense or the aorist tense, or also the pluperfect. We don't see the pluperfect as often though. If you have reduplication, you're going to know that you have the perfect tense or the pluperfect tense. So the pluperfect is going to have both reduplication and the augment. But again, the pluperfect is very, very rare. So augment is going to equal imperfect or aorist tense. So that's going to narrow you down to those 2 tenses if the augment's there. If reduplication is there, that's going to narrow you down to the perfect tense. And then you check for tense and voice morphemes. That is whether there's a passive voice morpheme or a aorist or perfect tense morpheme, something in the middle of the word that comes after the locomotive, after the lexical morpheme, that tells you more about either the tense or the voice of the morpheme. That's going to sort of further narrow down your parsing information. And then the last thing to do is to identify the person and the number and the voice. So sometimes you'll need to look at the suffix to be able to figure out what the voice is, whether it's active, middle, or passive. But primarily you're going to be getting person and number information from the suffix. So let's look at this at a little bit more in depth. These 3 steps with a little bit more going on here. So when you're checking for the augment or the reduplication, remember an augment may appear as a lengthened vowel or after a prepositional prefix. So it's not just simply looking for an epsilon because the augment comes in different forms. It might be a lengthened vowel and it might come after a prepositional prefix. And as I said in the last slide, the augment is going to indicate the imperfect tense or the aorist tense. And then if you have an augment, the next thing to look for is for this saw aorist tense formative. If you have a saw with an augment, then you know for certain that you have the first aorist, that you have an aorist tense verb. If there is no saw, if there's an augment but no saw, you're either going to have a second aorist tense verb or an imperfect tense verb. And if it's built, if the word that you're looking at, the verb you're looking at, is built on the present tense, then it's going to be imperfect. If you can sort of take off the augment and add on, and take off the ending and add on an omega to the end as the suffix, then you know that you're going to have an imperfect. So for example, if you have a Juan, you know from this epsilon augment that you either have the imperfect or the aorist. You take the epsilon off and you see pistu. You take the suffix off as well and replace it with the first person singular primary active omega, the O, then you get pistu O, and you recognize that as, of course, what? Yes, that's right, pistuo, I believe. Way to go, high five, 1, 2, 3, boom. And you know that you then have an imperfect because this pistuo, or this pistu, has not changed its form. That it's just added the augment, it's dropped this, and added a secondary active ending, but it's still built on this present tense stem. But if the stem has changed, then you know that you have a second aorist. Remember, what is characteristic of second aorist tenses is that they are strong verbs. They change their form. Just as in English, we change the present tense go to a different word altogether, went. Similar with the second aorist. So that if you find something like Elthon, get our accent and breathing mark on there. If you find something like Elthon, you recognize this eta as the lengthened connecting, or not lengthened connecting vowel, the lengthened augment of epsilon, and you look up Eltho by replacing this on with O. You're not going to find Eltho as a present tense verb. And when you look in the dictionary and you don't find it there, you're going to know that you have a second aorist. And what you're going to end up doing, actually, and we'll talk about this in just a second, is actually going back and looking up this form with the on in it. And then the vocabulary list is going to tell you that this is the second aorist form of erkomai, I go. So this is I went in past time. So all that to say, if you don't have a saw and you have a form that's built on the present tense stem, like a pistuon, then it's going to be an imperfect tense verb. If you have it not built on the present tense stem, it's going to be a second aorist, as in Elthon. And then if you have reduplication, of course, you have the perfect. And if you have no augment or reduplication, when you check a verb for augment and reduplication and there's none there, then you're going to know you have either a present tense verb or a future tense verb. And then number 2 here, our next step is to check for tense and voice morphemes. So if you see one of these, a saw, a ka, a sigma, a theta, eta, or simply an eta, you're going to know you have either the first aorist tense if it's saw, you have a perfect tense if it's ka, you have a future tense if it's sigma, and you have a passive voice verb if it's theta or eta. And then you go on to identify the voice, person, and number based on the suffix, based on what comes at the end of the verb. And here I give you, and let me take just 1 second to clear away my writing. There we go, that's better. Here I give you what the different suffixes, the primary active suffixes, the primary middle passive suffixes, the secondary active suffixes, and the secondary middle passive suffixes, what they are used for with respect to the different tenses. So if you have a primary active ending, you're either going to have a present active indicative verb or a future active indicative verb. And a difference, of course, is going to be the future active is going to have the sigma future tense. if you have a primary middle or a primary passive suffix, you're going to have one of these forms. If there's a theta, eta, and a sigma there, it's going to be a future passive. If there is a sigma but no theta, eta, and the primary middle passive suffixes, you're going to have a future middle. If you have just the lexical form, or just that sort of locomotive morpheme, and then the middle passive endings with none of this other added stuff, you're going to have a present middle or a present passive form. And then moving down to our secondary active, these are going to be used for the imperfect active indicative, the first aorist and second aorist active, and this is going to be indicated by the saw morpheme for the first aorist, or a changed root for the second aorist. A first and second aorist passive is also going to use the secondary active, and that's going to have the theta, eta, or the eta, as well as an augment. That's also true of the first and second aorist active. It's going to have an augment as well. And then the perfect and pluperfect active are also going to use secondary active with reduplication, and in the case of the pluperfect, an augment and reduplication. And then the secondary middle passive endings are going to be used for the imperfect middle and passive, the first and second aorist middle, and the pluperfect middle and passive, with the other different additions going on with them. So that those suffixes then become your clue not only to person and number, but also oftentimes to the voice of a verb. And so how this works out, I'm going to give us a little chart here, and this is where we're moving to some practice. And I want to show you that I'm giving you this chart also in black and white as sort of a printable cheat sheet for you, so that you can see the steps for identifying parsing information, have the master suffixes chart on one page, along with the different indicative tenses that get used with these different suffixes. But what I want to do is go through some of these together, get you some practice going through this sort of three-step method of identifying parsing information. So what I want to do is, starting out with number one, I want to check for augment or reduplication on all 6 of these here. So what I want you to do, let's actually go ahead and number these 1 through 6. Sorry, I should have done that on the slide itself. And go ahead on your whiteboard, so pause the lecture, and on your whiteboard, identify which numbers have an augment or reduplication, and as well indicate whether it's an augment or reduplication. And so it looks like this. The number 1, number 2, number 4, and number 6 all have the epsilon augment. So in no case do we have a lengthened vowel. This is all the simple or the usual form of the augment that you'll see. And then we have reduplication in number 3, lelumai. So we know that 1, 2, 4, and 6 are all going to be one of what 2 tenses? What are our 2 options for when the augment is there? That's right, either the imperfect tense or the aorist tense. Way to go. 1, 2, 3. High five. And let's go ahead and move to our next step here. Actually, let's look at sodzite really quick as well. So because there is no augment here, this is going to be one of what 2 tenses? That's right, present or future tense. And we'll come to figuring out what they are in just a moment here. But let's go ahead and check for tense and voice morphemes. So what I want you to do is go through each one, and on each one, label or write down on your whiteboard what tense and voice morpheme there is in each one of these 6. And so what we have is 3 different tense and voice morphemes in our 6 different things here. We have a passive tense morpheme in the theta, eta in number 1. And then we have an first aorist, this is a passive voice morpheme, not tense morpheme, my apologies. And then we have a first aorist tense morpheme. So this tells us that we have a first aorist, and this tells us that we have a passive. So we had our first clue that we might have an aorist with the augment here. And then the sigma alpha is going to make it certain that we have an aorist, a first aorist, and the theta eta is going to tell us that we have a passive voice. And at this point, we only have indicative mood. So we have an aorist, passive, indicative, and we'll come back to the person and number when we do number 3 here. Our other tense or voice morpheme is the tense morpheme saw in apistu saw. And once again, it's the same morpheme from up here, the first aorist tense morpheme. So we know that this one is going to be aorist, not only because we have the augment, but also because we have the saw morpheme. So here we have an aorist, and we don't have any, because we don't have a theta eta, we know that this is not going to be a passive, so we know it's going to be a middle form. So aorist, middle indicative, and then we'll identify the voice, person, and number based on number 3 here. And we'll do this with all of these here. So what I want you to do is let's get the rest of the information out about each one. See if once you go to looking at this, the suffix charts, and what verb forms it's used with. Let's see if we can get all the parsing information. If you can write down all the parsing information for all 6 of these here. All right, so this is what we're going to have with respect to person and number for each one of these. And I apologize for my chicken scratch here. But what I want to do is just walk through each one of these really quick. So we already said that this is an aorist, passive, indicative, and the new here, or the whole son ending, you might remember this from sa, sas, sen, salmon, sati, san, from when we memorized those first aorist forms, is going to be the secondary, and in this case, it's going to be the plural son here. It's going to be a secondary active. And we already know that we have an aorist passive indicative, but when we come down to the secondary active, we see that the first aorist and second aorist passive are going to use these endings here, the secondary active ending. So that's sort of confirmed for us, and we know that we now have a third person plural. So our parsing information is aorist, and more specifically first aorist, passive, indicative, third person plural. When we go down to elabanta, we're looking at the ending anta, and specifically we're going to be looking at the nta here. The omicron's technically the connecting vowel, and we find it right down here in the secondary middle passive suffixes. So we come over and look for secondary middle passives, and we saw that we have an augment, so it's either going to be imperfect or aorist, so imperfect middle and passive, or first or second aorist middle. And so we have to make a decision whether this is going to be imperfect or aorist. The augment itself doesn't tell us one or the other, so we have to look at the form. And remember when we went back and sort of retroverted apistu on and found that was based on the present root. With elabanta, we have a changed root. That the present tense form is lambano. The stem has changed, which means it can't be imperfect because it's not built on the present tense stem. That changed stem means it's going to be a second aorist middle. So we have an aorist, more specifically second aorist, middle indicative, third person plural. So that's going to be our parsing information from lambano. And so when we translate it, it would be they received. And then lelumai, we said was going to be perfect based on our reduplication here. We look at my and find that this is a first singular primary middle passive ending. So we look at primary middle passive and we see that we either have a perfect middle or a perfect passive. And remember, the perfect middle and the perfect passive forms look identical to one another. So based on just the word, just the form of it, we don't know whether it's middle or passive. We would have to determine that from the context of the sentence itself. So here we have a perfect middle or passive indicative, first person singular. Next, we have apistusa. We already said that this is first aorist, and we look at our sa ending here, and we know that it's going to be first person singular. Remember from our aorist endings, sa, sas, sin, samen, sati, san. And so we have first aorist, active, indicative, first person singular. And then sodzatai, remember we don't have anything in front of it, and when we don't have a reduplication or we don't have an augment, we know that we're either going to have present or future. And to determine whether it's present or future, we'd have to see if we have any tense or voice morpheme. We don't. There's no sigma here to indicate the future tense. So we know that this is going to be present indicative, and then we look at this tie ending and find it over here as a primary middle passive suffix. So we come over to the primary middle passive, and since we know it's present, we're going to have a present middle or a present passive indicative. So just like the perfect middle and passive, the present middle and passive forms are identical to one another. So by the form, we don't know whether this is middle or passive. We would have to determine that on what? That's right, the context of this sentence. So we have a present, middle, or passive indicative, third person singular. And then lastly here, we have apistuon. So we said with this augment that we either have an imperfect or an aorist. We didn't see a saw, so we know it's not a first aorist. So if it's an aorist, it's going to have to be a second aorist. And we look at this new ending here, and we find it over on the secondary active chart. So either the first person singular or the third person plural. This new ending is used for both. And we look over to the secondary active over here, and we see that it can be imperfect, or we could have a first or second aorist active. These have to be actives because we don't have the theta eta or an eta here. And just like we did with elabanta, we have to figure out whether this word is built on the present tense stem, which would make it imperfect, or whether it has changed its stem form, whether it's gone to its strong form as the second aorist does to form the past tense. And we see, as we already had this example, that pistuo is the present tense form. We take off that epsilon and we take off the ending and add an omega there, and we know that that's the present tense form that we would find in the dictionary. So there hasn't been a change to the stem, so we know that this is imperfect, giving us then an imperfect active indicative, first person singular or third person plural. So based on the form, we don't know whether it's first singular or third person plural. We would have to know that information from the context of the sentence itself. And the last thing we're going to do here, so here again I give you this for reference and for you to be able to print out, and I will excerpt this from the slides and put it onto Moodle as a standalone document. The last thing we want to do is sort of walk through how to figure out the lexical or dictionary form of a word when you come across it when reading a Greek sentence. And basically what you do is you sort of work backwards from what you did when identifying parsing information. That if there is an augment, I should also say, or reduplication, you're going to remove that. You're going to remove any tense or voice morphemes that you recognize in the verb, and then you're going to change the suffix, what's at the end of the verb, to an omega. And this is the primary active first person singular suffix. And that is going to give you the lexical or dictionary form that you would look up in your vocabulary list or your lexicon. And I recommend doing it in Black's vocabulary list first, because he is very good about giving you second aorist forms, which is the sort of caveat we have to go to here. So if you do all this, if you make all these changes and then you look up the word in the vocabulary list and it's not there, then it's most likely because it's a second aorist form. so that you've sort of retroverted into a word that doesn't actually exist in the form that you've made it. So if you don't find it in the dictionary form, then what you should do is put the augment back on, and rather than changing the suffix to an omega, change it to an omicron nu, or as I tell you right here, and then look up that word. And then you should find in Black's vocabulary list, if it is indeed a second aorist, that he tells you this is the second aorist form of this verb. So for example, if you were to look up the word abalon in Black's vocabulary list, he would say this is the second aorist of balo with 2 lambdas. And if you were to go through these steps, if you were to remove the augment, remove the epsilon, if you were to change this ending to an omega, and you were to look up balo with a single omega, or a single lambda, you would not find this form in the vocabulary list. And that's why then you go back and actually look up this form in the vocabulary list. So what I want to do is with each of these, I want you to retrovert, following these steps on your whiteboard, retrovert these into the form that you would look up in the vocabulary list. So go ahead. These are all the ones that we just did with respect to sort of identifying their parsing information. What I want you to do now is give us the form that you would look up in the dictionary on your whiteboard. And as you do that, I'm going to do the same, and we'll meet back here and see what we come up with together. All right, your results should probably look something like this. We'll go through and just make a couple of remarks on a few of these here. Didoxo, if you were to look this up, you would actually not find this form in the dictionary. Didoxo is not the lexical form, but rather it's didasco. Didasco, I teach. But by finding didoxo, you might sort of be reminded of didasco, and hopefully that would trigger you to recognize what is going on here. And the reason for that is, remember, when this theta eta is added, certain changes might happen to the root for pronunciation purposes, and we did not learn the rules for that. Black does not present them, and I don't present them in order to not crowd your mind, but hopefully finding the form didoxo would remind you enough of the word didasco, I teach, to be able to find this. If you were to look up labo, you would not find this form in the vocabulary list. You would not find it in a lexicon. So then what you would need to do is go ahead and change this back, add the augment back on there, and look up alabon with the omicron nu ending. And what you would find if you were to look this up in the vocabulary list or in a lexicon, and I should say here also that not all lexicons are, they vary as to how many second aorist forms they put in them. But the vocabulary list in Black would certainly tell you that this is the second aorist form of lambano, which then would give you the verb that you're actually going to look up in the dictionary or in the vocabulary list. Luo is what you should have when you take off the reduplication and change the my to an o. Our very well trod verb we've seen many times. And then pistuo is what you should come up with when you take off the epsilon and replace the saw tense formative here with an omega. And then sozo is going to be what you get when you take off the atai suffix here, the tie suffix with the epsilon connecting vowel. And this you'll find in the dictionary means I save. This is the lexical form. And then once again with pistuo, when we take off the epsilon and the omicron nu ending here. So all of this is to give you sort of a handy way to find parsing information about different words and give you a sort of order of operations, not only for figuring out that parsing information, but for looking up words either in Black's vocabulary list, which I would also strongly encourage you to tab in your textbook if you have not yet, or in a lexicon.